I think we can all agree that running a country is a difficult job. I mean, people say that being a mother is the hardest job in the world, and that's just one person you gotta feed, bathe, and protect from accidentally killing themselves. Multiply that by at least a few thousand, and it becomes pretty clear why this is a role that only the most qualified and esteemed members of society should hold. But still, leaders are human too, and unfortunately, they can sometimes be as ignorant, stubborn, and stupid as the average person. The only difference being, the average person isn't in charge of, in this case, 659 million people. Today, I want to talk about a leader who had a plan to bring prosperity to his country, only to fail miserably due to his arrogance and a lot of bad luck. So without further ado, let's talk about the failed revolution that killed 30 million people. Also, before the video starts, you should subscribe because, I need validation, that's about it. Anyway, back to the video. The main character of the story is this guy, Mao Zedong. Now unless you're a 3-year-old who somehow ended up here after binge watching nursery rhymes for 7 hours, in which case, you should comment mommy's credit card details for some epic Fortnite V-Bucks, you might have heard of a small Asian country called China. It's pretty hard to miss, it's only the most populated country in the world. And Mao Zedong was the guy who started it all. He established the People's Republic of China in 1949, and he was its first leader. Now up till this point, China had been going through a whole bunch of civil wars and invasions, so Mao had a lot of work to do to rebuild this new country. Plus, in 1950, China spent a bunch of money fighting in the Korean War, and they were broke by the time it ended. But after all this, Mao had a plan. He wanted to be part of the cool kids club, with countries like the US and the UK. But he didn't just want to be like them, he wanted to be better. He wanted to reach their level of development and surpass them, using only the resources and skills his country had. I guess you could say that this new plan would really be a great leap forward. This was Mao's shiny new plan to transform China completely. At this point, China's economy was mostly just agriculture, so Mao's plan was to industrialize the country while at the same time making their farms more efficient. It was ambitious, and unsurprisingly, it would take a massive overhaul to make it work. Mao's first step was to establish a complete government monopoly on agriculture. That meant that the government would control all the production and sale of food instead of the farmers themselves. Now the thing about people is that they're not very open to strangers suddenly waltzing up to them and taking over their land, especially after all the fun Europe had in the 1800s. So, just like how companies convince entire countries that eating pure sugar for breakfast was healthy, the government had to do this slowly. They first introduced small, mutual aid teams of around 15 farmers who would basically be under state control but could share tools and resources to help each other, and who could say no to some mutual aids from your farmer friends. These slowly grew in size, involving more and more farmers, numbering into the hundreds. Eventually, enough farmers were already under the government, and by 1958, all private ownership of land was banned. Everyone was instead invited to these fancy new government communes. Well, invited might be putting it lightly. Farmers who didn't join the communes were called into meetings and not allowed to leave until they completely voluntarily joined. So the government just decided to use a little bit of, what's the word I'm looking for here? Friendly coercion. He made laws saying that these communes had to ramp up food production to increase exports, and also send to people in urban areas, who had a priority under this new system. I'm sure the farmers had some things to say about that, but nothing a little friendly coercion couldn't fix. He also made it so that the farmers had to give up a lot of their produce to the government to store in case of a famine, which normally would be a smart move. But I don't think it's the best thing to store food for a famine while also trying our hardest to create a new one. Mao also implemented rationing in these communes to prevent people from using more food than necessary. Basically, at the end of all this, there was very little extra produce left. But Mao did get the results he wanted from these new laws. The production rates of farmers, the economy, and life expectancy all increased by 1957, and China managed to properly handle a famine due to the food supplies in 1956. This caused Mao to double down on these policies. And I mean, hey, why wouldn't he? If it works, it works. As long as the farmers kept making food without any interruptions and the government kept doing its job, everything would be alright. Meanwhile, Mao was feeling pretty confident with his new success, so he decided to open the floor to new ideas. This was the 100 Flowers campaign. Mao asked his people to give whatever opinion they had about these new policies and his government. In fact, he completely encouraged this new sharing of ideas. Now admittedly, coming from the government, this does sound like an undercover cop asking to buy one weed from the local drug dealer, but Mao legitimately wanted to hear his people's opinions. Well, that was until the Soviet Union, which China took a lot of inspiration from, went through some rebellions from its territories. Mao came to the swift realization that if enough people didn't like him, they could actually do something about it. So he quickly scrapped the campaign and instead came up with a new one. This was the anti-rightist campaign. Mao was so scared that the people were going to rebel against him, so he decided to weed out everyone who was against him and make their life hell. And wouldn't you know it, just a few weeks ago, people were freely expressing their opinions, especially the negative ones. What a lucky coincidence. Thousands of people were labeled rightists, which basically ruined their life and forced them out of society. A lot of these people happened to be intellectuals, so Mao had just gotten rid of some of the smartest people in society, along with everyone else who didn't agree with his ideas. Plus, Mao actually had a distrust for people with technical skills or an education. Now, this is usually considered a pretty bad move for multiple reasons, one of them being that you'd probably want a few smart people around if you're gonna run a country of 600 million people, but I'm sure it'll all be fine. While this was going on, Mao's communes were more popular than ever. By 1959, thousands of communes were set up, all full of farmers who just needed a little bit of friendly coercion to make the right choice. These communes were basically like cities and had their own schools, hospitals, and government. Everyone in the commune had a specific job assigned to them, and everything was shared, from tools to animals to food. The produce from these communes was then taken by the government to send to urban areas or for export. The government pretty much controlled everything from what the people did to how much they ate and how hard they had to work, and all the people had to do was do their jobs. And at first, it was going pretty well. A lot of farmers were excited by this new system, partly because they wanted to help their country, and partly because not wanting to help your country would be a death sentence. And so they worked hard at their jobs. And since everything was shared, resources weren't getting wasted and everyone could work more efficiently. There was fierce competition between these communes about who could produce the most food or work the hardest, all so that they could help their country become more successful. Mao was clearly popular and his plan seemed to be working. By the way, keep those commune competitions in mind, they'll be important later. At the same time, Mao's focus wasn't just on farming, he also wanted to industrialize China, and he had just the plan for that. His main interest was making steel, so he started another campaign, where all those farmers in the communes would also get a side job making steel. These farmers would get backyard furnaces, which were basically small-scale furnaces that anyone could use to make steel and help their country. Thousands of these furnaces were set up all across the communes. At long last, China was making progress on both its agriculture and its industries, and Mao's vision of the people of China working together to develop the country was finally coming true. Now let's talk about where it all went wrong. First, let's talk about the backyard furnaces. Now, you can't deny the fact that Mao really believed in his people. Unfortunately, thoughts and prayers aren't exactly a good substitute for metalworking experience. Although Mao thought otherwise, the farmers in the communes had no idea how to make steel, especially since Mao had just gotten rid of all the smart people. But they were dedicated, so these farmers went all in, smelting as much iron ore as they could get their hands on. When they couldn't find any more, they just used any other source of iron they had, like pots, bicycles, and even farming equipment. They used coal as fuel, but when they ran out of that, they used whatever they could get their hands on. 10% of China's forests were cleared to get fuel for these furnaces, and they even ended up using doors, coffins, and anything else made of wood. But again, these guys had no idea what they were doing. All this effort and these resources only resulted in the most crude and useless form of iron, called pig iron. This was brittle and needed a lot more processing to be turned into actual steel. Processing that, surprisingly, a bunch of farmers with zero experience couldn't just do in their backyards. Mao fully believed that technical knowledge and skills were necessary, and all you needed was dedication. And the people smart enough to know that wasn't true were also smart enough to keep their mouths shut. But this was the least of the problems facing Mao's campaign. You guys remember the communes? Well, unsurprisingly, they weren't doing too good either. Just like the backyard furnaces, Mao also expected a lot from these communes. The leaders of these communes were always in fierce competition with each other, and they set insane targets for their farmers, like doubling or even tripling production rates, all so that they could be Mao's favorite. These leaders forced their farmers to work long hours and tried loads of new techniques to hopefully increase production, like dumping loads of fertilizer on some land and hoping stuff grew there. Unfortunately, farming is a lot more complicated than that. If only there were smart people around who could help them out here. Mao also decided to build large-scale irrigation systems for these farms, but these two were poorly planned and rushed. And trust me, when you are dealing with transporting large amounts of water, you do not want to mess up. These projects ended up killing thousands of villagers, most of which were farmers who were already overworked from the communes. But what if, despite your most scientific efforts, your commune still wasn't producing enough food? Well, as a great man once said, you can always use the advanced technique called lying. The leaders of these communes felt that if they didn't meet and exceed expectations, they'd also be labeled a rightist. And so, they just provided Mao with some fake numbers to make him happy. And I mean, what's the worst that could happen? The farmers were farming, the leaders were leadering, and nobody has to know a thing. But like many great people in the past, there was only one thing that could ruin their plan: taxes. Remember how Mao's government was taking a lot of produce from the communes for export? Well, turns out, if you tell Mao that you've got a lot of food, he's going to expect a lot of food. And you're gonna have to give it to him. Tax rates across these communes were increasing, while actual food production rates were heavily decreasing. But since the leaders kept lying about how much food they were making, this left the actual people with very less food for themselves. And this supposed success was heavily advertised, which further increased competition among the communes. Plus, since a lot of the farmers were busy making the very useful iron in their furnaces, they didn't have as much time to farm, further reducing food production rates, meaning that the farmers had basically nothing. But still, things would still be okay, as long as the farmers still kept producing food with no interruptions. Quick detour for a second. During all of this, Mao also launched another campaign, this one called the Four Pests Campaign. Mao wanted to get rid of pests that carried diseases and caused harm, and one of the animals he wanted to eradicate was sparrows. Now these birds might look cute on the outside, but they have a dark secret. They eat food. Specifically, the food that supported the Great Leap Forward. So of course, Mao decided to get rid of them. This was a nationwide effort that involved killing sparrows, destroying their eggs, and even making loud noises to prevent them from resting. This pushed sparrows in China to near extinction. I'm sure this didn't have any unintended side effects. Just kidding, it did. You must be so surprised. At this point, some parts of China were already facing starvation due to the high taxes and the fake numbers, with some places giving up their entire food supplies as tax. But then the problem got worse. You see, sparrows are the natural predators of insects, especially locusts. These are a type of insect that also feed on crops, and now that the sparrows were gone, it was free game for these guys. A locust swarm hit China during this time, and this wiped out large amounts of food that was being grown. There was also flooding and drought in other parts of China, further destroying the farmers' crops. All of these made the starvation problem much worse. Millions of people across China suddenly didn't have enough food to eat, especially the ones who adopted Mao's policies the hardest. But still, China had prepared for this, right? I mean, all that tax they were collecting was being stored in case of a famine, right? Right? Well, the thing is, I think we can all see by now that Mao wasn't very good at taking advice and admitting he was wrong. Even though China was facing unprecedented starvation, Mao wasn't ready to admit that he was wrong. During this whole time period, China was still exporting food to other countries despite not having food themselves, just so that they could pretend that everything was okay. In fact, multiple countries offered Mao help to stop the famine. Japan offered 100,000 tons of food to help out, but Mao refused, just so that he could show everyone that he was right. Mao tried to find every excuse to put the blame of the famine on someone else, from not believing that there was starvation to accusing the farmers of hiding food, all while he kept doing business and selling food to other countries. So, the famine kept going. What started off in the countryside now was a national problem, as people everywhere just didn't have food to eat. People were reduced to eating leaves, soil, and whatever else they could find to stop their hunger. There were even reports of cannibalism in some places due to the famine, all while their leader pretended that everything was okay. While this was going on, it wasn't like the people didn't speak up. I mean, we did have the anti-rights campaign that heavily discouraged criticism, but people weren't just gonna take all these new changes without saying anything. But Mao, being Mao, couldn't let that happen, so he punished them severely. People who were accused of going against Mao's policies were put into public criticism. They were displayed in a public place and beaten with sticks to set an example to everyone else. Some others were sent to labor camps. But of course, once the famine started happening, Mao realized that his people were really suffering. And so, he did the right thing by punishing them even harder. Anyone who wasn't properly working or keeping up with their quotas were punished in ways that would make medieval Europe jealous. In fact, 6 to 8% of the people who died during this campaign were because of this torture from the government. In total, the most accepted number for the number of deaths during this famine is 30 million, making this the worst famine to ever happen in history. And that's not counting the millions who died from being tortured, or who were killed in building projects, or those who simply died of exhaustion from those unrealistic targets. You can actually see the effect of this famine on a graph of the total deaths worldwide. That spike is due to the Great Leap Forward. As this was going on, more and more people in Mao's government tried to speak up. The Minister of Defense at the time traveled to the countryside and first-hand saw the effects of the campaign. He tried to criticize Mao's policies in 1959, but Mao of course did the reasonable thing by removing him from his position and putting him under house arrest. But by 1962, support for the Great Leap Forward was pretty low, and after several conferences and discussions held by the government, the Great Leap Forward was finally called off. People who were arrested by Mao for speaking out were free to go, and foreign help was finally accepted to end the famine. But what happened to Mao, you might ask? Did he take full responsibility for his campaign, never work in the government again, get arrested for being an idiot, all of the above? The correct answer is none of them. You fool, you absolute buffoon. Did you really expect a politician to take responsibility for his own actions? Despite his giant failure, a lot of the farmers and the people affected blamed their local leaders for the famine instead of Mao himself, so he was able to get off relatively easy. And in 1966, he launched another political campaign that shot him right back to the top. So I guess the moral of the story is, if you ever mess up real bad and end up killing millions of people, it happens to the best of us. All you gotta do is keep blaming someone else, and soon enough, that's not your problem anymore. So yeah, that was the story of how one man's campaign to revolutionize his country ended up killing 30 million people, all due to the fact that he thought he was right and wouldn't listen to anyone else. Like the video if you liked it, subscribe, hit the bell, leave a comment, and watch another video by clicking right here. I'll see you guys later.